Thank you very much, and thanks to the Copernicus Center and all the people involved for inviting me. I find it a very pleasant environment and stimulating academically. So there is a whole current literature on religion trying to apply methods mainly from the natural sciences, either evolutionary type of arguments or cognitive sciences, and saying, well, we can measure something about religion or we can explain religion. And my considerations are, well, what's the impact of such projects? It's a kind of exploration of what might it be in that context. Just two examples. One is from an American author, Newberg, working together often with Eugène Dacqueuille, who was late. And this comes from a book where he writes, "The wisdom of the mystics, it seems, has predicted for centuries what neurology now shows to be true. In absolute unitary being," we'll come back to the terms, "the self blends into other. Mind and matter are one and the same." So he is actually very positive about cognitive science as showing something. And the other is from David Sloan Wilson. "Religion and other symbolic systems designed to motivate action have a beauty and power that seems to wilt, so to slip away when explained in functional terms." So that's more someone who voices that it undermines something. So 4 sections. First, some reflection on explanation and how it relates to elimination. Then towards the discussion about religion and explanations of religion. And then a brief comment in between about comparing that project, explaining religion, with some other explanations and concluding comments. So first part is explaining, and a first statement that's important, I think, to make is that explanation often affirms an experience. If I go to the doctor and say, well, I'm having pain, and the doctor says there's a trapped nerve, then by providing an explanation, the pain is not denied. To the contrary, it's made more respectable. It's shown to be really not invented, but really there. And when genes for a long time were not known and were identified as DNA, as particular molecules, well, that didn't undermine the reality of genes, but it did give us further precision about it. Or whether we explain the weather, well, the weather still is what it is, whatever the explanation. So explanation is not always undermining the phenomenon. In most cases, it just places it in a larger scheme of other phenomena. Genes as DNA, well, that connects it to chemistry and other things, but it doesn't undermine that. That's still a useful concept. Think about reduction is a term that arises in that context. Even when you talk about reduction as relations between theories, where one level of theory is shown to be a special case of another one, then it's not denying the reality of what the other one was describing, but the reality is less independent, is less an autonomous feature. For instance, when classical example, temperature is understood in terms of mean kinetic energy of the particles in a gas, well then, still temperature is a meaningful concept. So not all explanations, basically explanations are not threatening. Of course, better examples of reduction are not where it's fully equivalent, but where the new theory, in a sense, is more or less reproducing what the former theory delivered. Well, then still the phenomena are still real, but our understanding of it may be corrected. We know more because we now see it in a different light. We have learned something. We should be grateful for it and not be too afraid of it. So the first step is, I think, to say in many cases explanations are not undermining it, but they may have a serious impact. The story of someone who comes into a bit of a shadowy room and sees a snake in the corner and is frightened, and then when the light is turned on, sees that it turns out to be a rope rather than a snake. well, that person is relieved. There's an explanation that changed really the situation. So in such a case, the explanation may at once, of course, change how people see the phenomena. We learn more about the phenomena and it's gone. There's, well, you probably have other versions of it, but in Netherlands there is a Sinterklaas is coming early December, on the 5th of December, and bringing presents to young children or to older ones. And when they're about 8 or so, they learn that that's made up by their parents. And so they have a different explanation of what's going on, where the presents come from. And of course, that changes the experience. The innocence that it had originally is gone. It now is something we make up together. And it may change also one's own role in it, create new opportunities to become a participant in generating this. And if you might explain, well, someone is nervous, and you say, well, though female, it is a gender type of example, it's just your period. That may be also an explanation that gives offense, because it feels as if you're not taking serious the person's, the content of what someone says, but say, we have another explanation, there's some chemical imbalance, and so those kinds of explanations may really do something in the situation. So the first half was, well, explanations are not that having that much impact. These are situations where explanations do have an impact to the meaningfulness of the explanation, also to the situation itself. So there is this kind of feedback on the situation. When does that happen? I think it happens quite often, in a sense, because explanations do change the terms. Otherwise, it's not very interesting. If the explanation just repeats what already is in the first description, then, well, you haven't made much progress. The famous example is in a play of Molière, where I think, or it's somewhere else, well, where opium is said to put people to sleep because it has a sleep-inducing power. Well, that doesn't really help much. It just repeats, in a sense, with a slightly more Latin expression, what was already said. So if that's, that would be an uninteresting type of explanation. If you have a more interesting type, some of that impact is, in a sense, unavoidable, because the explanation does change the terms of what's going on, does change the description. Explanation is about changing the terms, simplifying, at least in many cases, the conceptual world by generating greater coherence across various descriptions. I think some of the themes that were earlier today about unity, coherence, well, I do think they're typical for trying to find an explanation. So there is a certain uneasiness, not too dangerous, but still it does have an impact, and needs, I think, more careful consideration case by case what he is. But I think when there is this impact, it often regards the kind of ontology, the kind of understanding of what the world is like. And the classic example there is from astronomer Arthur Eddington, who writes that there are in his study 2 tables. One is brown, a solid, heavy wood, and the other is mostly empty space. He used a description from quantum physics. Well, actually, he has only 1 table in his room, but he has 2 descriptions that are so different that it seems as if he's describing 2 quite different objects. And, well, that raises, I think, the example of something that was solid, where substance was something you could grasp because there is no empty space there, to a description that is mostly in terms of empty space. The tables still have the same properties in all practical senses. You can still, in the quantum description, explain why you can put a book on the table, or why you cannot put your hand through it, at least not without considerable damage. But the description, so the phenomena are still there, but the description is really fundamentally different, the picture of what reality is like. So there's continuity, but the idea of substance especially, I think, is then changing in this transition from the solid brown table to the quantum table. And I think that's typical, at least of the kind of explanations that we might be concerned about, that the explanation may learn us something, but that those lessons may bring certain losses of what we assumed was the case in how the world is. Even though the explanation cannot really undermine the practice of having a table where things, you can't put your hand through a quantum table either. But that has to do with apparently quantum properties also of the hand and the whole interaction. The description is different, but the idea of substance as excluding empty space, that seems to be gone. So explanations may have various consequences. The kind of summary of the first section. They may affirm the reality of a phenomenon, the example of pain or genes, in an enlarged and more integrated understanding of reality. They may explain with an ontological modification that we start seeing reality differently, or at least maybe we don't see it, but we take the lesson that reality might be different from our intuitions, or it might change in a way that really changes our experiences, and hence the phenomena themselves are affected as a visual illusion, or as something made up, a fiction, or some other way. I think that's the kind of range of options in a more, turning to some of the considerations on religion. Dean Hammer, that's a book, The God Gene, so he uses the word genetics immediately, and he writes the fact that spirituality has a genetic component, that's what he argues for in his book, implies that it evolved for a purpose. There is now reasonable evidence that spirituality is in fact beneficial to our physical as well as mental health. Faith may not only make people feel better, it may actually make them better people. So there's a kind of package that he says it's genetic, at least has a genetic component, means it evolved for a purpose. There's some dispute possible there, because it might be genetic and still be evolved well. Anyhow, and he takes it in a fairly positive mood. He places in the larger discussion, he distinguishes spirituality and religion. And religion is based on, also quote, based on memes, units of memory, traditions of culture that are passed not by DNA, but by learning, instruction, and imitation. As a result, memes, so those intellectual units, may or may not be beneficial to the people who hold them. So he puts religion in a more ambivalent light by saying, well, those are issues of culture, and they're transmitted and not really selected. And understanding the difference between spirituality and religion gives us, he writes, another tool in offering hope for the future. For while our spirituality may be engraved to a degree in our DNA, we can change, reinterpret, and reconsider the memes written on the scrolls of religious history. So we can change our religious traditions because that's cultural. Whereas the fact that we have a sense of spirituality, a sense of wonder, well, that's genetic, that's given, it's unavoidable. That's the kind of message he has. So he's not only offering an explanation of religion and spirituality, but he has clearly a particular agenda in that field as well, a particular view of how it should develop. Another example, Newberg, I already mentioned him, then also working with Eugène Dacouilly. They work with the fact that our brains have, in a sense, two halves, two hemispheres. And that's not their own invention, it started earlier, but that in normal functioning, when we see an objective world out there, that there's one hemisphere that's doing most of the work, what they call the dominant hemisphere. But they say, well, there are situations where people in a kind of meditative stance are not functioning in the same way. It's not no longer the dominant hemisphere that is shaping their way of experiencing the world, but it's rather the other hemisphere that does the work. And they have a whole account of pathways, how it works in the brain. But they say, well, then there are two ways of perception. There's the regular perception of an external world, And there is this other type of experience, which is what they think, what they call absolute unitary atemporal being. People being, well, feeling lost, independent of time, even though time passes in the external world, in their experience something of a different order. And since that's both produced by the brain, they say, why shouldn't we take both equally serious? If we take our experience of the external world serious, why be skeptical about the other type of experience? So they too, but more through neuroscience, they too actually use some elements of modern science about how humans are constructed to promote a particular type of spirituality, as they see it. Well, quote, the neurology of transcendence can at very least, provide a biological framework within which all religions can be reconciled. But if the unitary states that the brain makes possible are, in fact, glimpses of an actual higher reality, then religions are reflections not only of neurological unity, but of a deeper absolute reality. So they see two steps. One is all humans have the same type of brain. They all are predisposed to this kind of mystical mindset, as well as the more operational mindset in the world. So it gives a kind of unity, universality of all religions, independent of all doctrinal differences. But the second point is, well, just like we take the external world serious, this type of experience should be taken to be about something, and hence a deeper absolute reality. So there are some authors who actually pick up elements from the scientific study of, well, of humans and of human cognition to make a kind of advocacy of spirituality. A third author, just as an example, is David Sloan Wilson, who is famous for work on group selection, on a book together with Elliot Sober on altruism, how it comes that groups can function without being overwhelmed by cheaters, by free riders. But he has a book, Darwin's Cathedral, where he applies evolutionary biology to religious traditions, different ones, one chapter on Calvinism, but also on other groups. And he writes, as a kind of general idea, the hypothesis I'm seeking to test proposes that religion causes human groups to function as adaptive units. This hypothesis has many rivals, including religion as a tool of exploitation, as a cultural parasite, as a byproduct of cost-benefit reasoning. So he at least acknowledges that there's a field of competing explanations. I think the others are more naive there. And his focus is it helps groups of people get along and function well in this group. That too, in his understanding of religious belief, intimately connected to reality by motivating behaviors that are adaptive in the real world. An awesome achievement when we appreciate the complexity that's required to become connected in this practical sense. So he emphasized the practical side. It is true that many religious beliefs are false as literal descriptions of the real world, but this merely forces us to recognize two forms of realism: a factual realism based on literal correspondence, and a practical realism based on behavioral adaptiveness. So Wilson says religions are useful because they stimulate the right kind of behavior by maybe telling stories that are wrong, factually speaking, but still they stimulate, so in his chapter on Calvinism, the emphasis on judgment and God's sovereignty, well, that helps to provide on earth, in the group, a social order that works well. And that's the achievement. So his type of approach is, his type of approach is more immanent and not promoting a particular spirituality like the other ones. More recent, I think, cognitive studies of religion and of free will, there's a whole industry of that kind. So just to point out a few of the different schools that I see arising there, There's one group that focuses on ideas, and especially I think the idea that there is a God up there, an agent who somehow is able to do things that we are not. There's a whole, testing industry, mostly on very young children, to see whether it's natural, whether they already have a very, very early tendency to think in terms of agency, of thinking actor. And the conclusion is, well, yes, it's natural. It comes easily to humans to assume that there is agency. We ascribe it to our machinery, we ascribe it to trees, whatever, what they call hyperactive agency detection device. We are triggered to, if we make a judgment, to more often move towards more agency than see it as kind of mechanistic phenomenon. And those agents have what in this line of thought is kind of dominant counterintuitive properties. They can do things we cannot do, but modestly. I mean, they're mostly like humans, but they can be at multiple places at the same time, or move through a wall, or know more things than we can know. There are elements there that are others. So there's a tendency towards animism, belief in ghosts, and monotheism. So that focuses on beliefs, this school of thought. I think that's kind of program. And the other type of program that I see in cognitive studies is far more focusing on the experiences, like some of the early quotes, that tries, for instance, there have been studies done on Buddhist monks, placing them in a scanner and seeing what happens in the brain when they say that they are in a particular state of meditation. And the same has been done with Catholic nuns when they are praying. And of course it's a bit unusual to be in those machinery and still try to do your more regular type of behavior. But the conclusion is, well, yes, something is going on in the brain when those monks meditate or when those nuns pray. And also those states are somewhat similar to each other relative to, more external type of world functioning. Someone like Wallace, for instance, American Tibetan Buddhist advocate, is very much into this type of work. So I think there are those kinds of research, and I'm not in the empirical world, so research myself, so it's more that I read about it than that I know. And I mentioned one example also about free will, which has attracted already for quite some time attention. Typical research there showing that our actions, if you instruct people to do certain things, that the action seems to come first before the brain registers the decision to act. So that's kind of argument against free will, at least in some discussions. Some concerns about those kinds of research, more as questions to put to the empirical people, to the people who do the research. Starting with the last one, the operational approach to free will. All those projects need a certain way of making it operational, making it specific, how to test it. And there it's kind of looking at timing and at how fast do people respond. And one of the things is, well, maybe free will is not about how fast people respond. It's if you give them the time to reflect, what are their responsible choices. And if freedom is more seen in that light, then many of the practical research that are about quick responses are not really getting to what's important about reflection as feeding into responsible free will. And also training and preparation, how much it catches what happens in the event, and not so much in the longer term how people have been prepared to act. And part of the freedom is in that process of going along with the researcher and saying, well, yes, I bring myself in a certain state to act. So I think the free will discussion is, and I'm not the only one, of course, is certainly more thinking about what do we mean by free will, and what are we focusing on, and what are we measuring. And the same in a sense about religion. So the first kind of school of focusing on particular beliefs, on the kind of animism type of beliefs. Many serious reflective thinkers about religion would say, well, that's only a very minor part of it. Of course, there is a whole range in thinking about religion, or for instance about Christian philosophical religion. There are those who are very much on that side. Richard Swinburne, a British philosopher of religion, is clearly about belief in the sense of cognitive claims, and they're true or false. But many others in a long history, I think, of would say, no, there is far more existential dimensions involved of how do people relate to what they take to be there, and that's not grasped in those tests on agency. Oh, I should move on. And also the other side about religious experience, something is going on in the brain. Well, yes, that may be a fairly trivial conclusion, but this doesn't work without self-reporting, without involving the subject and how they experienced it. So there's more, and I think the deep question is how to catch the genuine subject in those projects. But that's the side of research. What if the research is successful? Oh, this is a remark that the various authors do have. They're not just scientists, I think. They are people who bring their own beliefs about spirituality and religion, their own preferences to the project as well. Let me skip that for reasons of time and move to what I consider the conclusions. Back to the beginning, explanation need not be elimination of a phenomenon, but reductionist explanations, and I think we're seeing those, do change the terms, and often that's especially they change the ontology. When it's applied to think about God, I think in terms of religious studies, God is not a phenomenon to be explained. Belief in God is, but God is part of the explanation. In non-naturalistic traditions, God revealed himself, God showed, God did this or did that. And such explanations do compete with naturalistic explanations. So I do think that for religious thought there is a genuine challenge in, at least if the religious belief is claimed to be based on particular experiences, whether it's a revelation or miracles or personal experience, then other explanations of those experiences are competing at least and making it not false, but making it potentially superfluous. This is about the few examples that I picked. So Hammer, Newberg, Dacqui, they focus on experience and claim that that shows a referent to reality. Wilson focuses on behavior, so he makes more difference between an insider account of how people would say they relate to an external reality and what's going on in his terms as a social process. I think in a more naturalistic understanding of what's going on in the world, Wilson is the kind of example that fits best. Religious beliefs may be understood as helpful shaping a community, as normative guidelines, as motivational expression of praise, or maybe also of judgment and control in the community, rather than as sources of information about the world and about a transcendental reality. So I think Wilson's program, the other program is challenging because they tend to wipe out all differences between religions. This one is challenging because it seems to challenge the referent. This is the final sheet. Upon a naturalistic explanation, so if one accepts with David Wilson that also human culture is to be understood in such a way, religions are among the human phenomena in the world, with languages, political systems, other social phenomena. Religion would not be an exception. Human religions are not gaps to be explained as if these are not explained except by invoking God, whereas the weather is explained without reference to God. Kind of philosophical conclusion at the end. Well, so what? If we don't have those gaps in religious life, in human religious life in various forms, I think many, at least in the school that I see presented here most, are highly critical of any God of the gaps type of approach, of saying, well, there are phenomena in reality that somehow science cannot explain, and that is where we have to begin doing theology. Because we also have to do theology about all the phenomena that we do understand, and be also at the experiential level, gratitude and awe, appreciation applies not just to the gaps, but to everything. So the final, just as with regard to biological evolution, even without any such gaps, one can assume, but it's an assumption, it doesn't follow, it's not a conclusion, that there is a ground of existence, a creator of natural reality, some source, as the source of all natural and social processes. However, such a view needs philosophical arguments and not empirical ones.
Thank you very much.